this is the fun kind of sunshine that people have been speaking about. Of course, there's other ways of looking at this, more critical ways to say that he was a prime minister who was out of his depth. Something we perhaps haven't discussed enough today is COVID. But if you take a look at the report there, by the joint report by the Science and Technology and Health Select Committees, it is extraordinarily damning on some of what will happen to be the largest policy failures in living memory. We've taken a slightly different view. We've used this concept we've been developing called leadership capital. This is obviously a very common phrase, but myself, Mark, and Professor Paul Hart have developed this way of measuring political leaders' authority over time. What this really tries to say is that there's a certain amount of authority a politician is gifted, and they can spend it, they can attempt to conserve it, or they can, most importantly, lose it over time. Now, I don't want to go through all 10 of these, but I wanted to flag up a couple of these that are most kind of relevant to Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. A lot of these have actually already been discussed, so I'll be very brief. We've talked about Boris Johnson's reputation as the great communicator, but it isn't the communicator in the classical style. Of course, the Peppa Pig World levelling up speech was a great example of that, but it was more in his informality and asides. As Robert Saunders said earlier, it does seem that Boris Johnson's informal approach to communication was found particularly wanting in the pandemic. Remember the 10th of March 2020 press conference where he joked about squashing the sombrero, and of course more recently the allegations, rather dark allegations around Jimmy Savile that even upset his own backbenchers. Similarly, of course, the Heineken politician reputation was built atop this supposedly remarkable capacity to reach voters and popularity. But if you take a look at this graph here, you can see that Theresa May was much more popular than Boris Johnson. His unpopularity has actually gone to depths that Theresa May's have never seen. Again, similarly, this myth that Boris Johnson's, let's say, slightly distrustful and dishonest behaviour was priced in by the electorate simply isn't true. You can see the British electorate have always had a pretty healthy scepticism and distrust of Boris Johnson that's greatly increased since May of last year. This isn't to say that Boris Johnson wasn't important at certain times. In 2016, he had a very important effect on the result of the referendum. Perhaps some academics have argued the decisive effect. Again, in 2019, which has been discussed today, Johnson's impact was very important, but arguably in a more narrow way than the myth has us believe. He was very influential with leavers, but not, for example, particularly in the Red Wall. It's important to remember that throughout Boris Johnson's kind of electoral victories, whether he was mayor or in the general election, it was actually more about his opponents' unpopularity than his own stratospheric popularity. So it was more about Red Ken and Jeremy Corbyn than Boris Johnson himself. And finally, something that's again been discussed really well in the last session was about the very fragile relationship between Boris Johnson and his own backbenchers. Of course, he's not the first Prime Minister to experience what Anthony King called the over-the-shoulder politics that now defines British politics, but it's been particularly tumultuous, of course, when he won with an 83-seat majority. It was thought he was extraordinarily safe, but his relationship with his backbenchers has frayed very quickly, not just over kind of classic conservative issues, but even over areas that you would expect there to be consensus, not least over the kind of COVID-19 tier restrictions. So our argument really using this concept of leadership capital is that Johnson has essentially been oversold by parts of the media, by his supporters, and of course by himself. Many of his strengths, when we dig into them, are more fragile or less solid than they appear. And his impact as leader was significant, but in a more kind of narrow and short-lived sense. And so over to the point you've probably all been waiting for. And if anybody's interested in Silvio Berlusconi, I'd strongly recommend you read this piece by Tobias Jones or his great book that came before it, which is called The Dark Heart of Italy. And we would argue actually the similarities between Boris Johnson and Silvio Berlusconi, which we talked about when Boris Johnson arrived in number 10, are even more kind of startling and interesting now. While we had this conference, you may notice that Boris Johnson has deleted from the ministerial codes the words, ministers must uphold the very highest standards of propriety. And that's one of the most Silvio Berlusconi things I think I've heard. Both of them, of course, styled themselves as anti-elite, almost anti-politicians. An earlier speaker called them both morally unorthodox, which is not the phrase Italians used, but it'll do for now. Both of them actually came to power amid crises, deep crises of the political system, when it looked like the political systems would fragment. Tangentopoli, Bribesville in Italy, Brexit in the UK. But actually, ironically, it was crises that the two of them both helped to create themselves. They were both held up as transformative. They came to power on the promise of transforming Britain and Italy. They're both, of course, to use John Street's ideas, celebrity politicians, run a highly kind of personalist politics, and they both seem to operate, again, taking this idea from Rutger Helms, on media logics rather than political logics. They have a hugely informal style, but actually in terms of policy delivery, there's very little to show for. And I just offer a few thoughts about Boris Johnson's future based on what we know of Silvio Berlusconi. Silvio Berlusconi was a huge election winner, spent nearly 20 years in Italian politics, much of that time in office. But the main legacy that he left was that of an election winner rather than a politician who did anything. And the main legacy in political terms was changes to the party system rather than the transformation of Italy that he promised. And Berlusconi's end actually came in kind of two ways. There was the slow burn of continuous corruption and scandal that gradually eroded his support base. People essentially, voters essentially got tired of it. But then it was the economic shock of the economic downturn that meant he left office very quickly thereafter. So with those thoughts, I'll close and Mark will help out with any questions. Thank you for listening, everybody.
Thank you very much. So next up, we have Ferenc Hörcher from University of Public Service in Budapest. How to avoid being conservative, Merkel and Johnson.
Hello, let me first of all share with you my slides. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes, and yes.
Great. So let me start with the analysis. I mean, it's quite interesting to come after this comparison between Johnson and Berlusconi, because what my job is to compare Johnson to Merkel. Why? Because my question is what's happening with conservatism. We heard this afternoon a number of times the question whether Boris is conservative, whether the party is conservative, and whether conservatism as such exists. That would be perhaps the largest or most wide-ranging question. And the answer is that there is an explicit decline in the West of conservatism. No conservative party is in power since Merkel and Kurz in the continental Europe. The EPP is pushed back in the European Parliament. Trump has fallen after one term. So the question is there a common cause behind this phenomenon? And what explains the fact that Boris is still around? Is it perhaps the result of Brexit? Apparently, Brexit is a conservative cause, a par excellence conservative cause, provoking the politically correct world, returning to full national monarchical sovereignty, and also opposing the metropolitan voter. And he actually made it possible. He let it get it done. So that's an achievement, and a conservative achievement, perhaps. Yet we do not see many other features of his achievements, which might be called conservative. He is not too explicit on illegal migration. He avoids LGBTQ issues, no mention of marriage, family, religion, sort of things like that. So then what is happening here? Is he avoiding conservative policies, or what's happening? And if that's the case, why? Is it because voters do not expect it from him? Is it because the media and the opinion mongers do not accept it? Is it because a global economy or the financial markets do not allow it? Or is it his spin doctors who would not like to push him in that direction? And that's where a comparison might be useful, not in order to show that they are similar, but to see the similarities and the dissimilarities in the same time. Both of them top executives, chancellor and PM of their country, the most powerful states in Europe. Both of them have to great traditions of conservative or Christian democratic rule. Both of them very successful in uniting their camp behind themselves in the critical times. Both of them symbols of their own, well, not ideology, but symbols of their own political stance. Yet, both of them playing against their party's conservative identity. Now let's see the different. These were perhaps the obvious similarities, but what are the differences? Of course, to be a woman and a man is still a difference in top offices in politics. Also, coming from a background is different. Merkel arriving from the eastern part of Germany, from beyond the Iron Curtain, so unlike the elite of her party and of the elite of Germany, while Johnson represents the party elite as such. Her manners are reserved and moderate as far as her personal style was concerned, while Johnson, as we heard today, is a celebrity and almost like an extremist as far as his own relevance is concerned. It's interesting to see how they relate to their own tradition. One of them, Johnson, claiming that he represents that tradition, what he calls one nation conservatism. Merkel did not use that strategy or that rhetoric. She did not want to argue for general principles or basic values as such, only in certain contexts for certain purposes, and not like an ideological stance. Is this a rhetorical difference only? And what's the cause of it? Well, Johnson's image is still not that of a conservative leader. Otherwise, we would not discuss it today so often. And the more interesting the thing is, if we look at this by now famous illustration of Elon Musk's own position, if a leader like Merkel or Boris would simply stay at the position that they occupied earlier, they would naturally become more center-right, more right-wing than earlier. And that's why it's really interesting to see that the whole spectrum seems to be pushing on the left, and that therefore they seem to follow that direction, that tendency, that stream towards the left. Let's see some of the major issues that they had to confront. Merkel confronting the global financial shock crisis in the early 2000s, the Eurozone crisis, migration crisis, LGBTQ issues, and of course the COVID. While Johnson, of course, a shorter period so far, Brexit, COVID, of course, the personal crisis of the Partygate issue, and finally the war against the Ukraine, which Merkel is not confronting anymore. So my last two slides will be about Boris Johnson's rhetoric, because I think that finally, if we want a conservative position, we would have to find it in speeches. At least there is very difficult to imagine a conservative leader without the conservative rhetoric. And In order to check this, whether it relates to Johnson or not, I took an early one from 2019 and the 2022 one. Let's see what I have got here. Of course, he keeps referring to himself and the party as conservatives, and tries to present the conservative case, but the issues that he brings up is, well, arguably it's coming from one nation conservatism, but it's more a leftist agenda, I would say, serving the people. We are the party of the NHS, and problems of social care and social injustice. That's the sort of language that he uses. Of course, we heard again today that there was a strong demand for that in the days, and he wanted to answer that demand, but that excludes, I would argue, you know, a strong and ideologically sound conservative position. And even if he refers to right-wing agendas like deliver economic growth, it's not conservative per se. It's much more, I would claim, a classical liberal small state agenda. Let's see the 2022 talk. The traditional conservative answer, a strong economy. What again, we come back to well-paid jobs, safer streets, better healthcare, that sort of thing. So what we see is, you know, trying to argue for both the right-wing agenda of growing economy and private sector liberties, free trade. Our wonderful free market system, as he calls it. And on the other hand, he is still the man of the, you know, courting the red wall voters, like arguing that we will have more to pay our fantastic NHS and that sort of things. So conclusion. Well, Merkel is a clear case. She did not have a conservative image. She is Mutti Merkel, a petit bourgeois image, and she did not use conservative rhetoric. How about Johnson? Johnson has a conservative rhetoric, but his image is still not conservative. It's a political celebrity's image, combining issues of free trade, capitalism, which is a right-wing, perhaps a Thatcherite, but not conservative, and a discourse of social justice. For the first time since the 19th century, British conservatives have to serve the working class on its own terms. So that's Philip Blond's view. And his ideas, though, might be found contradicting each other. Words such as capitalism and NHS are really hard to make friendly to each other. While in power, Merkel remained popular. After her disappearance, the party declined. The post-Merkel era is a total decline, loss of credibility for the conservative cause. What's the case in Britain? Johnson's popularity is, as we saw in the earlier talk, in decline. Does he burn the credibility of an authentic conservative stance? That's something that we shall see. Thank you for your interest, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have Agnès on can Borisonian populism dissolve into Johnsonism?
Hello, can you hear me? Can you
yes.
see me as well? Okay, I'm going to share my screen as well. If I can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this organization. I just want to share my thoughts with you about this notion of Borisonian populism, which I hope will be clear later on. But my first question is there such a thing as Johnsonism? won't really try and answer this question, but I want to adopt a much more narrow perspective than what we had previously in the day. And I want to focus really on the form and the style of Johnsonism, not so much on the contents. And for the sake of comparison, I want to look at Thatcherism as, in terms of form and style, as formally defined as a style of personal leadership, with a set of various ideas that, well, ultimately made sense, and a framework of think tanks that actually shaped what was later known as Thatcherism. So if we apply this to Boris Johnson, it may first seem counterintuitive. What we have indeed is a peculiar style of political leadership, as we'll see, but a striking lack of ideological consistency at the moment, at least, with the persistence of a strong neoliberal component, regardless of One Nation Northerners and the Red Wall conquest, and the presence of think tanks, but they appear to be at odds with the interventionist agenda of the party in the run-up to the election. So my question is, what is interesting to me is not so much the contents, but the dissemination of Johnsonism as the product of a two-way process of interaction between Boris Johnson, a political leader, and his advocates. And the point I want to make is, how does Johnsonism circulate among supporters, and not so much how are his ideas spread, than how they are received, adapted, digested, and reinterpreted by his advocates. And so the starting point is an expression used by Matthew Flinders here that I want to discuss in a chapter published in Britain Votes, where he talked about the UK-style populism as being defined as a form of centralized, even autocratic leadership, essentially centered around the personality of Boris Johnson, hence the expression Borisonian populism. So there is here a clear obsession with a man among commentators, with Boris Johnson himself, his personal speeches and behavior, whereas the question of Johnsonism, it seems to me, is to be understood beyond him. So what I want to do is really look at the 5 features of this Borisonian populism, as you can see here, and look at the way they could be applied beyond Johnson himself, breaking the rules, distracting dramaturgy, territorial targeting, Brexit and Brexitism, upper crust populism. I won't go into the whole details of all the 5 elements because I won't have time, but just to look at a few of them. Rule breaking, to start with, is something that we've talked a lot about, of course, following the propensity of Boris Johnson to bypass rules and institutions, to lie in Parliament, to prorogue Parliament in August 2019, and of course the Partygate scandals. So the question is there a new pattern of rule breaking that has been initiated by Johnson and taken over by MPs? Of course, the recent scandal in November 2021 concerning Owen Paterson was not another MPs, was not a new phenomenon, but what is interesting is how, in fact, MPs reacted to that. And there's a clear tendency among MPs to either play down the impact of the scandal, as you can see here, George Eustice talking about Westminster storm in a teacup, or simply to pretend it did not exist, restraining from even using the word Partygate, or immediately discarding it. You can see here Graham Stewart, for them this is Partygate, and another example, Mark Spencer talking about Partygate in inverted commas, and then of course mentioning the ministerial code we've already talked about. If we go back to, if we move on, sorry, to the second feature, which is distracting dramaturgy, this touches on the performative aspect of populism. We'll get back to this notion probably, including the verbal and non-verbal communication, according to Benjamin Moffat. If we think about non-verbal communication, of course, we all remember Johnson staging himself in different situations, often presented as clownesque. But for Flinders, this actually misses the point that such behavior fulfills a political role by attracting attention while distracting attention from really important issues. So you might think that Boris Johnson is quite unique in this feature, but there's only one perhaps exception to this in the person of Jacob Rees-Mogg, who has been keen to indulge in the same staging strategy with his sort of, you might say, anachronistic eccentricity, lying on the bench, as you can see here, or playing Rule Britannia in September 2020. In terms of the verbal communication, I'm not going to expand on that because I think we're going to have a nice paper on metaphors. I've written elsewhere about Parliament versus the people and anti-Parliament discourse among Conservative MPs, and how, in fact, not so much Boris Johnson than his colleagues used all kinds of picturesque metaphors to refer to the Remainer Parliament. And it started not with Johnson, but actually with Jeffery Cox, Attorney General, who was the one was the first to talk about the dead Parliament. Then many, of course, Conservative MPs use other metaphors like the zombie Parliament, or here Turkey Parliament or Chicken Parliament, again in the mouth of Jacob Rees-Mogg. Now, territorial targeting is also an interesting point. It's really, well, here the element has been associated with the party's ability to win seats in Labour's Red Wall. And for Flinders, the Conservative Party under Johnson toned down the talk of global Britain and instead focused on what he called England beyond London. What is interesting is in Johnson's speeches, this resulted in persistent ambiguity. He kept talking about the people in our country with confusion about the personal pronoun. And this was taken over by MPs as a way perhaps of blurring the Englishness behind unionism, as you can see here with Bill Cash, using the same ambiguity, the rights of our people, our own voters, with very few MPs actually reasserting England and well, resurrecting the English question, perhaps one exception here being John Redwood, clearly talking about England in 2020 in relation to Brexit. Now, Brexitism and Brexit, I won't expand on that. I found it very difficult, to be honest, to touch upon this dimension, especially as what it meant was to dissociate Brexit from Brexitism as a kind of combination of promised futures and feel-good politics. And it seems to me that most narratives on promised future were actually related to Brexit. But with COVID and Ukraine, new narratives were put to the fore. One of them is quite interesting here. Of course, Daniel Hannan, well, the reactions are not mine, the emojis are not mine. Daniel Hannan describing Boris Johnson in the context of the Ukraine war as the leader of the free world, but this should still have to be investigated. The next and final point is upper crust populism, according to Flinders, which is clearly, even though there's, of course, this is a debatable version of populism as being limited to Parliament versus the elite, as Andy said this morning. But here it's clearly the most widespread rhetoric, because the idea of sacralizing the people versus targeting the elite was shared by many Conservative MPs, regardless of their own ideological positions in the party. And we see quite clearly this sort of schizophrenic tendency to castigate the elite while being a representative of the establishment. And this is a reference to Jan Werner Müller. What is interesting is that Johnson once again did not initiate this move, because this rhetoric was actually found earlier. And among many MPs, you have a few examples here. John Hayes talking about the globalist elite. The same Hayes, even using Marxist terminology, talk about the bourgeois liberal elite. Alexander Stafford, the liberal elite, and Owen Paterson, who was involved in the scandal, describing the political establishment as hating Brexit, the commercial establishment. The CBI hates Brexit and the media establishment hates Brexit, suggesting that, of course, he was not part of the establishment, of this establishment. So to conclude, I would simply focus on 3 points. The fact that, of course, what we have is Johnson's, clear, overwhelming political capital, to use an expression previously employed by the speakers. But what is also interesting is that in terms of Johnsonism, there's only partial duplication of his personal and, you might say, opportunistic populism. We can observe a process of duplication of Johnson's idiosyncrasies before and after the general election of 2019. But of course, whether it will sustain the long-term viability of the Boris bounce is less than certain in the present context. What is interesting, however, is this new widespread rhetoric around the people, which was produced by the referendum result as much as by the use of this institutional procedure. So this new rhetoric may be a turning point in the style that future leaders might adopt, but it's far from certain that they will continue, of course, using the referendum as a new practice. So if Johnsonism actually survives, this could be envisaged in this new obsession with the people and with popular sovereignty, both in speeches and in government practices. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Last but certainly not least, we have Andrew Roe-Crines. I'm going to timer so you know what's going on metaphor and the rhetoric of crisis management, Boris Johnson and COVID.
Okay, thank you very much for sticking around to listen to my paper. Today we'll be looking at how Boris Johnson has used various metaphors in order to communicate his message to the voters. In light of that, the purpose of the paper is to present some initial thoughts on how Boris Johnson has used and continues to use language when describing the COVID crisis. The rationale for the paper is to present some elements of an initial hypothesis that may emerge into something which is more substantial, a more substantial research project. This is by no means comprehensive or complete, as that would be unnecessary for the purpose of outlining some initial thoughts and premise. Indeed, part of the reason I'm presenting here today is to put some of these ideas out there, not just on the language that's been used by Johnson, but the specific forms of language that he's used during the COVID crisis, so that audiences, namely the British public, will be compelled to some extent by the tones and the illustrations to change their behaviour in response to the COVID pandemic and the strategy set out by the government. Also, just to add, the paper assumes no prior knowledge of rhetoric, although a working knowledge of the basic concept will be useful. As we look back at some of the rhetorical tones and arguments that have been used recently by Johnson. So, if you are basically interested in rhetoric, hopefully you may find it of use. To assist with that, I'd like to start by saying a few words about rhetorical metaphors as a tool of analysis. This is because they act as a vital communicative mechanism between speakers, the politician, and audiences, the British public, in so much as they facilitate the process of discourse between complex ideas and the simplicity in language. So, to briefly explain, as you'll know, in the classical world, which contains many examples of rhetorical theory, these were used to divest and to deconstruct the art of effective speech making and the movement of audiences through words. Pleased to hear I have no intention of to introduce each of them, nor do I intend to spend any time or much time outlining each of the concepts, not least because it's impossible perhaps to carry out, and it continues to occupy classicists, historians, political rhetoricians, and contemporary scholarship across many subdivisions, including political science. Yet we cannot consider any rhetoric without first acknowledging it as an ancient skill that modern politicians continue to use today. So, for many rhetorical concepts devised in the ancient world, many remain relevant in contemporary political discourse. They are used by politicians as a matter of course, yet often go unacknowledged, especially by the skilled speechwriter or the knowing politician. However, as a sub-discipline of political science, rhetorical analysts study the structure of language, the rhetoric, the means of delivery, the oratory in our current set of political leaders. Also, the modern politicians, the same aim as their ancient counterparts, namely to convince an audience of their arguments through inspirational speech, using emotion to motivate audiences. Their own character produces the value-based connection, whilst the empirical foundation of an argument provides the logic. The characteristics are fundamental to what Aristotle described as the modes of persuasion, which we'll not be covering today. Rather, we'll be looking instead at what Aristotle described as the metaphor. In the rhetorical text of the ancient world, Aristotle commended those who use the metaphor, thus demonstrating its value, because it's the greatest thing by far to have mastered the metaphor. This is because the metaphor is a powerful rhetorical tool that enables the transfer of knowledge to take place. It does this by comparing two things that are not alike, by stating that one is the other. Put simply, it is communicating a concept or a complexity in a way which would be instantly recognizable to the audience. They help audiences visualize unfamiliar ideas or concepts, apply meaning to the unfamiliar, and add texture or value to public speaking, parallel the intangible with literal forms, and have impactful reputation and reception with audience members. Thus, the metaphor is not because all audience will be instantly familiar with the basis of the argument. In this sense, metaphors are instead used to help an audience to understand a new idea or a set of circumstances that they may already know. In deference to time, I'm going to skip over the rest of my explanation and justification for the concept of metaphor, and instead can start considering Boris Johnson and the issue of COVID. So, how can we identify how the metaphor was used by Johnson, or more specifically, the tone of the metaphor and the wider language which was used by Boris Johnson during the management of the COVID crisis? Well, the aim of his arguments will be to project a sense of confidence that his strategies are evidence-based and with the aim of saving lives. Now, recent headlines concerning Partygate may well lead many to question that motivation, thereby impacting his persona in the present. However, looking back at the time of delivery in March 2020, the impact of his speech has projected a sense of unity amongst the majority of the country in that COVID was a serious problem that needed to be addressed. The more recent issues are out of scope for the hypothesis because they have nil impact on his persona at the time in which he originally delivered the metaphors. But I just want to nip that one in the bud before moving on a little further. So for here, I'd like to focus on how Johnson's use of the metaphor during the crisis itself enabled him to manage the justifications for lockdown and the overall aims of protecting the country from COVID using a sampling of such metaphors. Back in 2020, how did Boris describe the COVID pandemic to his audiences? Well, he famously used the metaphor to characterize COVID as an unexpected and invisible mugger. This describes COVID as a force that cannot be seen and cannot be stopped by civil or conventional means. COVID is characterized as a violent actor who appears, steals, destroys, then moves on. Metaphorically, it's a physical entity that visualizes the COVID crisis as something that exists, which audiences can recognize, but are also instinctively and intrinsically afraid of. Nobody wants to be mugged. So the idea that COVID is a mugger, here to steal everyone's lifestyle, is to stun the audience into paying attention, and that ultimately, this could be a mugger which is taking aim at all of us. The framing of COVID in this way is designed to highlight or sell the situation. As Johnson described, a fight in which every one of us is enlisted. Again, using familiar framing. There is already, you'll see, a combative element to the language which places COVID into a conflictual relationship, thereby implying the solution is similarly violent. By doing so, it's presenting the solution to COVID as a battle, a zero-sum game, which can be won or lost depending on our actions. The battle, based on the language, is designed to be won. But who are the fighters? Well, put simply, it is presented here as something in which we all have a personal role in or duty to engage with in order to defend the country from the impacts of COVID. Again, this is a war between good and evil, right and wrong, which is simple but deliberate framing, because the aim is to compel reactions rather than to convey information. The tone can be found throughout Johnson's rhetoric as a way of invoking broadly defined, the so-called wartime spirit of the 1940s. Indeed, this sense of defense or combativeness frames his use of militaristic metaphor in order for audiences' reactions to see their role as a member of an army against that unknown foe. For example, he characterized the government's approach to COVID as one that must act like any wartime government, his words, whilst engaged in a campaign for survival. Here, he argued he would marshal all the resources of governments in the fight against this invisible enemy. The militaristic language is deliberate because he believes the British public will respond positively to it, seeing the metaphors as presenting a clear route to action. Now, we don't have time here to outline every example. However, as progress was being made over the course of the crisis and the development of the vaccination, the UK would enter what Johnson described as the end of the first phase of the conflict. Even here, the linkages to military metaphor in Johnson's crisis management remain dominant. This is no accident. These are no sort of incidental moments. This is planned and strategized because it seeks to invoke historic yet unlived memories of the wartime period, with the sense of pride projected by Winston Churchill's memory of the Second World War. But this is not the only rationale for using militaristic metaphors during the crisis. This is because the war on COVID also aims to present the crisis in medical terms. The invisible enemy is a virus that we can defeat in our daily lives, Johnson suggested, and that the best way to overcome it will be by keeping clean, washing our hands and taking the time to sing happy birthday twice, using hand sanitizer, wearing a face covering, protective gloves, etc. It is your duty. These are measures taken to mobilize the population and to make an enemy of the unclean world around us, the COVID world. Thus, the battle lines are drawn and the fight begins. But why? Well, militaristic rhetoric is frequently used by central governments to invoke reaction from populations to mobilize action if the wider explanation or justification would be too complex to communicate in a simple way. Thus, the solution is to present the action needed, not the justification, to the audience in terms that are easy to understand. Therefore, binary rhetoric between X and Y, right and wrong, clean and unclean, becomes the simplest yet most effective ways of delivering on the desired outcome. Therefore, the action is against a common, if unseen, enemy that can strike at any moment. And the language is designed to project this sense of immediate fear into the audiences because the governments believe they need to in order to ensure survival. Survival being the measure of success. We can also see this in the description of key workers, i.e. those necessary to maintain the function of society whilst lockdown is underway, as frontline workers. The frontline becomes or invokes an imaginary memories of the First World War in the minds of the audience, again creating an image that is memorable so that audiences can detect and respond to the severity of a situation. It also, in the case of the UK, enables Johnson and others to use these metaphors because of the successful outcome of the previous conflicts that he's alluding to and the continuation that resulted from them of the British way of life. Again, survival as a measure of success. This framing enables governments to justify mobilizing resources such as the armed forces, which hitherto they may not have done in peacetime. Who can forget, for example, the sight of the armed forces taking over parts of Liverpool or other places across the UK, including the gym at this very university, to conduct one of the most important parts or first parts in the war against COVID, namely the initial rollout of the lateral flow tests. These forms of combative language and the value of militaristic metaphor are vital for Johnson's rhetorical forms because it mobilized a mindset that was recognizable and actionable in curbing the virus. Some may argue that the ends could have been achieved in different forms, and it is very possibly true. However, for the purpose of this paper, the focus is on Johnson's use of rhetoric and his use of metaphor as a crisis time prime minister. But of course, those were the arguments that used in the early stages of the crisis in framing it. As it continued, the rolling out of the vaccination changed the style of language from an immediate combat, from an immediate conflict, which needs to be won, instead into the metaphor of journey. Oh, bloody hell.
Maybe that's it. Okay.
The journey was portrayed as difficult, not at all certain. However, for the metaphors used, it was clear. It was clear because the emergence of vaccination facilitated the formation of a successful narrative. The narrative enabled Johnson to then use language that provided an endpoint to the crisis. For example, this to me is like a train journey where you're standing at the station. Here, Johnson is presenting the crisis as something that he believes the vast majority of the audience will be familiar with, i.e. the feeling of standing at a train station. He goes on to portray the recent period as it's wet, it's windy, it's horrible. This is the lockdown period, the time when uncertainty dominates the minds of many. However, the hope starts to arrive. 2 miles down the tracks, 2 lights appear. It's the train. The emergence of the train enables Johnson to identify an endpoint to the conflict and what victory might look like, full immunization of the population. It comes with a note of caution. It is a long way off. However, the announcement of hope, in this case, the vaccination, shifted the language towards a wider trajectory in which the wartime sacrifices of the British people and the armed forces will be realized in a moment of victory, survival, and most importantly, the lifting of restrictions. Victory here is no longer simply allowing the virus not to kill. It becomes a way to remove the virus from our lives. Now, given time, I will pause and stop there. However, just to say, many, many examples of metaphor used to change behavior because communication of the actual evidence, the actual argument is too complex to put into an argument. So metaphor communicates in a simple way. Thank you. Sorry to go away.
Thank you. So we have 10 minutes for questions. Do we have any questions? Or I'll take 2 then. So we'll go Anthony J.
First of all, just a quick round, it's quite a substantial body of literature on metaphor in the age crisis. It might be interesting to call the divisions about how abstractness of the key viruses, diseases, and how policymakers turn to metaphor to navigate through things.
Yeah.
General question for the entire panel, given that this is on Johnson's style. We've talked throughout the day about how Johnson is unlike pretty much anybody else in terms of its delivery and performance and so on, except the fact that that's not true. And he's exactly like his dad in his behavior, in his delivery, and no other member of the Johnson family is. Has anyone considered the influence of his dad and the extent to which he kind of serves as a model for what Johnson is like?
And so I'll just repeat that for the audience on Zoom. Boris Johnson is very much like his dad, Stanley Johnson. And has anyone considered that? And we'll take Jay's question as well.
Yeah, just for Andrew, I'm just wondering if you think that Boris Johnson's rhetoric during the crisis was something that would be unique to him, or is it something that maybe previous prime ministers would have also done if they were in an identical situation?
So that was, how much of this is something Boris would have been uniquely posed to do, or is this just something any leader would use? So I suppose we'll start with Andrew, and then we'll see if any of the other panelists want to feed in on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Right, okay, so was Stanley Johnson taken into account basically when considering Boris Johnson as a Conservative Party leader? I would say by the vast majority of the population, almost certainly not. On the grounds that they are not familiar with Stanley, and so would not have really taken much time to find out what he was like as a political figure. However, there is definitely, arguably, something of a continuity in style. I think he was prominent during the Brexit referendum, but not as a Brexiteer, as I remember. But regardless, that difference actually helps the authenticity of Boris Johnson because it enables him to portray himself as an authentic and principled person that's able to even go against the judgment of his father in order to do what's best for the country. So it works well for him. But in terms of the general lecture, no. But those that know will probably find there is definitely a parallel there to some extent. In terms of your question regarding whether or not anybody else could have used this kind of language, I would say no, because ties into Johnson's previously constructed rhetorical persona which has been building for about 20, 25 years of creating this linkage between himself and Churchill. It is the deliberate strategy, but it is now so well used and so consolidated that it is a strategy which you can just pull out of the air and do. There's no actual, real, I would suggest, purposeful thinking about it. He wouldn't sit at a desk, for example, going, what would Winston Churchill do about this crisis? I think he could just turn it on like that because it's well rehearsed, it's well practiced. Whether or not, as we've discussed earlier on today, people find deficiencies in the comparisons is a different matter. However, for Johnson's ability to kind of invoke that kind of rhetorical tone, it is well practiced and it is pretty much part of his rhetorical persona.
Mark has a point to actually, so does Ferenc. So if we start with Mark.
Hi, great. Thanks a lot. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. So yeah, on the questions, I'm not aware of anything relating to Boris Johnson's father. So that's not something we've considered. I really wanted to sort of come back on Andrew's point a little bit on use of metaphors and sort of actually looking at some stuff in terms of Boris Johnson and crisis leadership. I wonder whether he's going to be thinking about the use of metaphors by Jonathan Van Tam, who seemingly used them very successfully and very well. Whereas Johnson, really coming back to the point that was just made, you know, they seem to be a knee-jerk reaction or the sort of, you know, unthinking kind of metaphor. So yeah, I'm interested in this. The viewers maybe that the communication was poor, went badly wrong during COVID, and a lot of that was to do with the Johnson's use of language. Interesting to compare that with Jonathan Van Tam's sort of calm, careful, thought through metaphors that we use. So I just wanted to, yeah, maybe see what Andrew thinks about that.
Thank you, Matt. I think that's a really good point. I think it's an excellent potential comparison there of different kinds of metaphors, equally as effective as each other, but of course with different kinds of audiences. So you're getting the kind of jingoistic audience that will find Boris Johnson's metaphors appealing, and then you're getting the more sort of pragmatic kind of audiences that would find Van Tam's metaphors appealing. Both of them, though, using the same kind of rhetorical strategy of communicating complex ideas simply to an audience so that they can be instantly recognizable by that audience in order to change behavior, not necessarily outline the case for changing that behavior using advanced arguments, largely because they will be mostly lost, but the metaphor is there to basically, yeah, as you'll know, communicate complexity in a very simple way. And I think both of them do it, but use very different styles of metaphor, both of which are consistent with each other's style and persona, especially Boris Johnson.
Ferenc?
Yes, I would try to address the first question. Stanley Johnson, I refer to the fact in my talk that Boris, as opposed to Merkel, belongs to the elite of his country and represents it and embodies it in a certain way. So I think in that respect, I addressed the issue, which is that in fact, Boris, when he tries to keep power, is endangering that very elite's credibility in front of the general public or the electorate. So in that respect, the risks are higher, so to say. And I would like also to address the problem of rhetoric. I made the distinction between Merkel and Johnson, that Merkel had a very low profile, low-key rhetorical strategy, while Johnson, as an earlier journalist, makes very powerful use of rhetorical weapons. And in spite of that, my claim was that conservatism is more than rhetoric. So we cannot catch conservatism by either a strong or a less pronounced rhetoric. What you need is to see the value hierarchy in the background and the basic principles. And the problem with both of these politicians and leaders was that they did not have much of that for themselves. They were very good at crisis management, at least for some time, and it seems that for Boris Johnson, both the Brexit and the COVID came as a good opportunity, because crisis is almost always helpful for big leaders, and that's why they like that, and why they present the case always as a crisis situation. And to be sure, we have now another crisis in the Ukraine, and therefore the issue is still with us, and that might work on his hand to crisis manage any longer, and not to address the issue of long-term vision of a post-Brexit Britain. Thank you.
So I have time. One last question, Danny.
Okay, this might be beyond all the papers, but I was just thinking around how successful the crisis management rhetoric was. I mean, I'm thinking of Van Town saying we're 3-0 down, and we're, you know, then it was 3-2, and then eventually we actually won. But the point is, how successful was Boris Johnson's rhetoric in enabling vegans, you know, making sure that people were obedient to the rules and accepting Downing Street, obviously.
Well, again, we're not going there. Because we're contextualizing this at the time.
Yeah.
In March 2020, the upkeep or the uptake of the rules and the regulations was very, very, very strong. Very high compliance. So I would say that the initial kind of metaphors and ideas and rhetoric we put forward were really effective. You only had to, you're not really supposed to look around what was going on in towns and cities and things, but you only have to look at what was going around in towns and cities to see just how deserted they were. At the time, when I remember a picture of the M62 at rush hour, one car. So I would say if the objective was to stop people from moving about and to get them to stay at home, it worked. Of course, that only lasts, compliance only lasts as long as the rhetorical character and the values are in place. So if you go sort of traveling around the country, then say to Barnard Castle or anything like that, that can then affect the credibility of the arguments, and then people start to break them. So it only really, the rhetoric of compliance, well, the expectation of compliance and the ability to get that compliance is dependent upon your values and your ability to obey those same rules yourself. I know there's a massive elephant in the room on this one, so I'm not going to go there. But
do you think that the sort of metaphoric nature of it? Sorry, I'm asking.
Go on very, very quickly.
Yeah, sorry. I'll finish there. I'll close it there.
Okay.
Just the way I finish on that.
Right. Okay. Oh, Mark. Yes. Do you have? Ready to make the?
Yeah, just to come in on that point, really, when we've been looking at leadership capital as a tool to understand sort of the ebb and flow and trajectory of political leadership, you know, we look at skills, relations, and reputation, and this goes beyond the sort of rhetoric of crisis leadership, although that's very much part of the skills element. You know, if you need to build the relations, whether it's, you know, inside government or outside, and then you need to develop a reputation as part of that for actually getting things done. I think during COVID, there was, you know, a failure across all these elements of leadership in terms of communicating effectively, then building sufficient relations, and then providing the reputation that demonstrates that you can actually get things done. So, you know, I think you know, communication and the rhetorical part is one part, but that has to translate into making the right calls at the right time, involving the right people, and then getting things done.
Great, thank you very much. Before we finish up, I'd like to just remind everybody about the Thatcher's Ministers event, which is taking place on Thursday, June the 23rd to Friday, June the 24th. And unlike this conference, which is kind of sought to centre Johnson as an individual, the Thatcher's Ministers conference kind of decenters Thatcherism, Thatcher from Thatcherism, and looks at some of the other architects of that kind of ideology, where they went with the grain, where they went against the grain. If you want more information about that, or I think there might still be a few cabinet members left for grabs, as it were, speak to Anthony. Apart from that, I'd just like to take a moment to thank our panelists again and thank everyone who's spoken today in the appropriate way.